Welcome, Internet, to Psychoanalytic Talk. And today we're going to be talking about the 3 levels of personality as defined by Otto Kernberg. So, let me preface this by saying that I find the theory behind it very interesting, as it tries to explain how the personalities structure themselves, and also, in a way, what can be done, what should be avoided in those personalities. It's not types, it's really structures, meaning that it's not about a diagnosis really, it's more about like a level of organization. So that means that basically the 3 are like different branches, right, of personality, where there can be some connections, but they kind of, every one is kind of split in its own section. So let's start with the more massive part. We'll go from the more massive to the more normal side of things, or the more common, should I say. So the first and more massive we're going to start with is the psychotic level of personality. So at this level, the individual has a lot of issues distinguishing himself from others. The mechanisms that are going to be mostly used are what are called primary defense mechanisms, meaning it's going to be about splitting, projecting, projective identification, expulsion of affect, and so on and so forth. So in this level of personality, reality can be lost, meaning that the person might not be able to distinguish if something is real, or if something is a mental phenomena. This level of personality, of course, can happen within psychosis, but also in certain personality structures, namely paranoia. In these cases, what happens is the person is, in a way, in an ontological insecurity, meaning that who they are, the sense of self, is completely diluted, meaning that their internal image of themselves is non-consistent. And it's often completely exacerbated, meaning that it's blown into proportion. For example, it's noted that certain people, for example, who have schizophrenia, can have an image of themselves that is completely overblown. For example, they can be delusional, thinking that they are a messiah, a god, a president, a king, and so on and so forth. And in those moments, reality is lost, and the personality is grandiose. Or on the contrary, at certain moments, for example, with people who have schizophrenia, they can have a complete withdrawal within themselves. At the very extreme, it gives catatonia, but in less extreme cases, it just gives a withdrawal, and the person does not interact. That doesn't mean that there are not delusions. That just means that the person isn't going to interact within a relationship, or refuse to do so. In those cases, reality might also be lost, but it's lost in another way, meaning the person can become suspicious, they can feel that someone is trying to manipulate them or control their thoughts, their reasoning. They can think that someone is trying to steal their ideas in their minds, that their minds and the real world, the outside world, should I say, are connected, that they can influence psychically the world outside, or worse, structurally, that the world outside can come into their minds and basically control them. So here you can see that the distinction between the outside and the inside, the Eigenwelt and the outside world, is completely porous, meaning that they're completely mixed up and entangled. There is no different self outside, and that's a major problem, as the internal conflict becomes between the self and the outside world, rather than having, for example, a superego or having internalized conflict. The conflict is externalized. However, I have to nuance these big ploys, as in reality, people with schizophrenia can stabilize themselves, can realize that what is real and what isn't real, thanks to medication, psychotherapy, insights, social help, work. a lot of things can help people with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is not, how can I say, a disease, a mental disease in which everything is always lost. It's also a state of being in the world in which the person is more vulnerable to losing reality and more vulnerable to detach himself or herself from the outside world. So in that level of personality structure, you have to understand that the self is so fragile that everything becomes porous, that the image of the self is non-stable. It's not even, it's unstable. It's like there's holes in it, and those holes make that the outside world just completely influences and penetrates the self or the ego, and that makes it very vulnerable, very fragile, and it needs a lot of help in order to regrow and reconstitute itself. And at that level of personality, it's often, how can I say, institutional help that's going to be able to really help the individual regain a sense of stability and a form of inner security. But that sense of stability is going to come slowly and progressively. At least from my experience, it's not like insight and then something is gained. It's more that you take care of the person. The more you take care, the more you talk to the person, the more you rehumanize the person, the more the person is able to distinguish between what's happening inside and what's happening outside. So I don't want you to understand this as once there is psychosis, it's over. It isn't. There is some level of work, some level of hope, and some level of progress that can be made, but you have to be, it's step by step, and you have to remain very humble in what's going to happen. So that's pretty much the first level of personality, the more regressive or the more massive of the personality levels. Moving on now to the borderline personality level of organization. So here, borderline has to be understood not as borderline personality disorder, but as like a hybrid between the last one that we're going to talk about, the neurotic level of personality organization, and the psychotic level of organization. So in this state, the self is constituted. The self is actually more solid than and less porous than the psychotic level, but it still remains fragile. In this state, it's discontinuous. It's not that it's penetrated by the outside world, but it feels the pressure of it. And that pressure is going to exert massive symptoms, like, for example, acting out, violence sometimes, self-harm, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that all these things can't happen in other types of organizations, but this is like a general rule of thumb, that basically in those structures, the self is there, but it's more the object relationship that might be more complicated, i.e. the others have an influence on the self and on the image of the individual. The individual, contrary to the psychotic level of organization, has a very discontinuous, but strangely enough, more stable image of the self, meaning that there is not a full loss of reality, and reality systems remains relatively okay, but object relations, meaning relationships with other people, is very complicated, as those people, for example, with borderline personality disorders proper, not the level of organization, but proper, can feel that they can over-evaluate someone, idealize someone, then completely devalue them and see them as the worst. So there is those extremes with the relationship with others, between completely good, completely bad. But it's not just the borderline personality disorders. At a certain level, schizoid individuals are at that level also, as they're afraid of connection with others. Here, it's not because their sense of self is discontinuous, as the borderlines, but because they're so afraid of being hurt, in a lot of cases, that they withdraw. So here, that withdrawalness is not linked to psychotic symptoms, but it's linked to the fact of being afraid, fundamentally afraid of connection. And they have also a very rich internalized world, but they cannot fully share it with others. So here we see that in that level of organization, it's much more refined and nuanced, because there are moments of it which are more neurotic, and moments of it that are more psychotic, meaning more massive, more intense in the behavior. But what you have to understand with that level of organization is that you have to, when you're working with those people, keep in mind both of the other extremes, the more common and the psychotic. The psychotic, because sometimes you're going to need to really put something of an interpretation on the early defense mechanisms, meaning something like splitting. You're really going to have to interpret that, try and make meaning to the person with a borderline organization, be him schizoid, narcissistic, borderline, as if, and so on and so forth. You're gonna have to really put in emphasis the relationship and the meaning that can be built through the relationship, so that the self can stop being discontinuous and become more stable within time. Or for the schizoids, to not necessarily have a more stable self, but have a more of a sense of security within the relationship so they can open up. Here I'm really speaking, and I must stretch this in theoretical levels, as it's very hard to do, right? It's like anything in psychotherapy, it is hard work, but it's doable, and that's what I'm trying to get through. So at that level of organization, reality isn't lost, but relationships remain intensely complicated for myriad of reasons. For example, in the narcissists, it's also a fear of being humiliated by others that makes them more defensive. But contrary to the schizoid, which is going to stay within a withdrawalness, the narcissistics are going to interact, but they're going to interact in a very specific way to gain admiration. They're not in search of love, but admiration. The schizoid is in search of protection from others, and the borderline is in search of an ideal. Very succinctly, that's pretty much it. And of course, I should talk about the antisocials, but I feel that that's a whole other area in which, even if I've had people with that criteria, I'm not that specialized in that. So I may or may not at some point in the future make a video on that category. So basically, fundamentally, what you have to remember is that the self is discontinuous in their states, and relationships with others is an issue because of all that has happened. Often people with borderline levels of organizations have experienced a lot of trauma. That trauma, of course, can be family related, but not only. It can be environmental, it can be social, it can be, for example, with states who are in war, it can be linked to the war, to abandonment, and so on and so forth, or to death even. So in these cases, the personality wasn't able to attain proper stability and was unfortunately had to adapt to extreme situations, and that adaptation to extreme situations gave extreme reactions which continue and persevere well into adulthood, because at that time the individual survived with those defense mechanisms. So it's going to keep them because the survival of the self was linked to them. So that's pretty much it, and you have to understand it at that level. So relational and the self. And the last level, the neurotic level of personality organization, is the more common one, statistically speaking, and perhaps the one that is the least problematic, meaning that in the relationship and in the idea of the person has the more continuous level of stability, and the interaction is facilitated. So how come? So basically, at the neurotic level of functioning, the person is gonna be able to have a stable sense of self, a stable image of oneself. That stability, that ontological security, is going to give the person the strength to be able to connect, to be able to love, to care, to build relationships in a more serene way than in the previous levels of organizations that we talked about. In this level, the person is going to be more concerned with inner conflict, meaning the conflict between himself and himself, basically, fundamentally. For example, it's a stupid example, but it's to get my point across. For example, a person is going to worry that, let's say, that he's, really a stupid example, but to get my point across. The person doesn't want to go to a party. They don't want to go there, but they feel that they have to for social reasons. So they go there, but they feel conflicted because they don't want to be there. They're not engaging at the best of their ability, and so therefore they're gonna fight in themselves to leave the party, stay in the party, and basically it's going to be that internal conflict. It's going to be a conflict with oneself mainly. So I should be very careful here because I don't want to induce anyone in a mistake. The others can have internal conflicts as well, but for the neurotic level of personality, that's basically the main type of problem they have, is internal. And that internality can lead to suffering. It's not to say that it's all happy all the time, right? Absolutely not. But at that level, they can recognize very thoroughly that they're having a problem, and the outside world is something different, it's something apart, which they know they can make an impact on, but they're not in conflict with the outside world when it comes to mental health. They're more understanding that it's their own source of issues. At that level also, the person is often able to connect to others in a positive and stable way. They truly care about others. I mean, psychotics and borderlines can also care. This is not what I'm saying, but they can take care of other people. They don't feel persecuted. They're in a stable relationship and a stable image of themselves. The others, for example, the psychotic, it's very discontinuous, and good and bad are intertwined, and basically they shift from one another very quickly, and they can be delusions, reality loss. In borderlines, the image of the others is going to be shifting between something that's positive to something negative, something that's good and something that's bad, a tension between committing and not committing, and so on and so forth. Neurotics commit to the others. That doesn't mean that they are all in long-lasting relationships, or people who have not in and out, that's not the right perception of sins, but that have one-night stands are not neurotic. That's absolutely not what it means, but they have the potential to commit with not much of an issue, whereas the others, more complicated. That's how I see it, at least, that all three levels of organizations all have potentials, but very different potentials. And therapeutically, with people who have a psychotic level of organization, the whole point is to build an inner sense of security for them to be able to apprehend reality without losing that distinction between them and reality, and to be able to build a sense of inner security. For people with borderline levels of organizations, the whole point is to build a relationship in order for them to be able to expand in a serene way to the relationship. And finally, with people with neurotic levels of organization, the therapeutic goal is going to be able to help them with their inner psyche and their inner conflict, meaning that instead of focusing on their perceptions of themselves and their conflicts, perhaps be able to make them more able to distinguish when something really impacts the real world or when it's more an internalized conflict. So that's pretty much it. Of course, here I think that I've made a lot of simplifications to something that's quite complicated, but nevertheless, I feel that level of interest in the personality organizations is a very good starting point, as it allows us clinicians to be able to know how to care about people in the best way possible. That you know that when you're having someone with a psychotic level of personality, you're going to care for them differently than when you have someone with a neurotic level of personality. And of course, and I should stress this enough, it's no Olympic Games of the psyche, meaning that everyone has their load of problems. That even though you might think that the neurotic level of personality is going to be happier than the psychotic level of personality or the borderline level of personality, it's not the case. Neurotics can be very miserable in their subjectivity and in their relationship with the world, and psychotic people can be happy. I've seen happiness, the stress in all three of those categories. So I really want to stretch this, that there's no winning. The winning is the moment, quote unquote, when people have reached a sense of security. Of course, in psychotic and borderline levels of functioning, that security is going to remain very vulnerable. So in the psychotic, but both of them feel vulnerable. Neurotics, once they gain that, it's often more solid, but that doesn't mean that they can easily gain it, or that the other ones cannot gain it. Everyone can gain a better sense of security. That sense of security is going to allow everyone, in theory, to be able to address their problems and be able to live a more happy life, if I can say so. So basically, that's the three types of personality organizations according to Kernberg, which I feel the model is very good and very interesting, but you always have to remain very nuanced, as in all theories, but very interesting nevertheless. So I hope you found this video interesting. If you have any questions, any comments, or anything you want to talk about, feel free to drop them by in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.